You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 30th of August, 2024, and you're listening to episode 79, I think, of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. Every week we get psychological, philosophical, and all manner of introspective. I'm David, and this week we are engaging in psychological warfare. Imagine this. It's World War II. You're a soldier stationed on a remote Pacific island thousands of miles from home. The days are long, the nights are even longer, and the constant threat of danger looms over you like a shadow. One night, as you lie in your tent trying to sleep, you hear a soft melodic voice floating through the airwaves. It's soothing, almost hypnotic, speaking to you in your own language, telling you that the war is lost, that your leaders have abandoned you, that surrender is your only hope for survival. You know it's the enemy, broadcasting from miles away, but you can't help but listen. A seed of doubt is planted in your mind. This, my friends, is psychological warfare. Now, we often think of war as something fought with tanks, guns, and soldiers on the front lines, but there's another kind of warfare, one that targets the mind, the emotions, and the very fabric of society itself. It's subtle, insidious, and incredibly powerful. Throughout history, psychological warfare has been used to weaken enemies, control populations, and even win wars without a single shot being fired. In this episode, we're going to take a journey through time, from the ancient battlefields where psychological tactics were first employed to the modern-day digital battlegrounds where the fight for our minds continues. We'll uncover the techniques and tools used to manipulate and influence entire nations, and we'll explore the ethical dilemmas that arise when war is waged, not just on our bodies, but on our minds. But before we dive into the details, let's start with a simple question. What exactly is psychological warfare? How is it different from the warfare we typically imagine? And why is it so effective? To answer these questions, we need to go back, way back, to the very beginnings of human conflict, where the seeds of psychological warfare were first sown. So buckle up and get ready to dive into the dark, fascinating world of psychological warfare. Whether you're a history buff, a psychology enthusiast, or someone who's just curious about the unseen forces that shape our world, this episode has something for you. Let's get started. Now, before I get started in earnest, for the benefit of my regular listeners, if you're wondering why this episode I am speaking in my sexy Jazz FM voice, it's because it's currently 1 a.m. on Friday morning and I'm having to do the recording and the rest of the house is quietly sleeping. So I've locked myself away in the office and I'm just trying to roll this out as best I can. It's been a mad day and this is the only window I have to do the recording today, so you're just going to have to bear with sexy David. Okay, so let's begin. Psychological warfare. To truly understand the power and complexity of psychological warfare, we first need to define what it is, and perhaps more importantly, what it isn't. When we think of warfare, we often picture the physical soldiers clashing on battlefields, bombs exploding in cities, and tanks rolling through war-torn landscapes. But psychological warfare operates on a completely different plane. It's not about physical destruction, it's about influencing minds, emotions, and ultimately behavior. So, what exactly is psychological warfare? At its core, psychological warfare refers to the use of various psychological tactics to influence the thoughts, feelings, and actions of individuals, groups, or even entire nations. It's about weakening the enemy's resolve, sowing doubt and confusion, and manipulating perceptions to achieve strategic objectives. Unlike traditional warfare, which relies on brute force, psychological warfare is subtle, often invisible, and can be waged without the target even realizing they're under attack. But to fully grasp the concept, it's helpful to break it down into its key components. First, let's talk about propaganda. This is perhaps the most well-known tool of psychological warfare. Propaganda involves the deliberate spread of information, sometimes true, often distorted, and sometimes outright false, with the intent to shape perceptions and influence public opinion. It's about controlling the narrative, telling a story that serves the interests of those who create it. We've all seen examples of propaganda in history. Think of the posters urging citizens to enlist during the world wars, or the carefully crafted speeches meant to inspire or intimidate. But psychological warfare goes beyond just propaganda. It also includes misinformation and disinformation. Now, these terms are often used interchangeably, but they actually refer to different things. Misinformation is simply false or inaccurate information that is spread without the intent to deceive. Think of it as an innocent mistake, like a rumour that gets out of hand. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a deliberate act. It's false information that is intentionally created and disseminated to deceive and mislead. In psychological warfare, disinformation is a powerful weapon, used to confuse the enemy, undermine their confidence, and manipulate their decision-making. Another critical element of psychological warfare is what's known as PSYOPs, or psychological operations. These are planned operations conducted by military or intelligence agencies to influence the emotions, motives, and behaviour of foreign governments, organisations, or individuals. PSYOPs can take many forms. Leaflets dropped from planes, radio broadcasts beamed into enemy territory, or even social media campaigns in today's digital age. The goal of PSYOPs is to weaken the enemy's will to fight, to demoralise and destabilise without ever firing a single shot. Now, these concepts might seem modern, but psychological warfare has deep historical roots. The art of manipulating the mind in conflict has been around for centuries, if not millennia. One of the earliest recorded thinkers to explore psychological tactics in warfare was Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist, whose famous work, The Art of War, is filled with insights on how to outmaneuver and outthink one's enemies. Sun Tzu wrote about the importance of deception, of making your enemy believe one thing while you do another, of attacking their mind before attacking their body. His ideas laid the groundwork for many of the psychological strategies that will be used in warfare for centuries to come. In medieval times, psychological warfare was used in the form of sieges, where attackers would spread rumours or use psychological pressure to force a surrender without a fight. They would cut off supplies, spread fear, and manipulate the defenders into believing that resistance was futile. Even in ancient Rome, psychological tactics were a key part of military strategy. Roman generals understood the power of fear and intimidation, using elaborate spectacles and brutal displays of force to break the spirit of their enemies before the battle even began. So, when we talk about psychological warfare today, we're really discussing a set of strategies and tactics that have been honed and refined over thousands of years. But while the tools and methods have evolved, moving from the battlefield to the broadcast airwaves and now to the digital realm, the fundamental principles remain the same. It's about understanding the human mind, exploiting its weaknesses, and using that knowledge to gain a strategic advantage. But psychological warfare is not just about history or theory. It's been a critical component of some of the most significant conflicts of the modern era, and its influence is still very much alive today. As we move forward in this episode, we'll explore how psychological warfare has evolved over time and how it has been used to shape the course of wars, influence political outcomes, and even manipulate entire populations. Before we get there, let's take a look at some of the most iconic examples of psychological warfare in history, starting with the global conflicts of the 20th century, where these tactics were deployed on a massive scale. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens. No, it's not at all, actually. It's sponsored by me and my book, which is out on Amazon, and you can purchase it as a paperback or on the Kindle, and it sits very much alongside this podcast. So if you're interested in philosophy and psychology and ways that these ideas can be applied to our lives in general, then the book is a really great place to get some theory and some practical applications of it. The premise of the book, we go through a few different scenarios. We talk about authenticity, about gratitude, about letting go of stuff. And there's a lot of stoicism, there's some Buddhism in there, there's all sorts of philosophy and theology that covers this stuff. And the end point of it is for you to be able to reflect upon yourself and whether you are living according to how you would want to live organically, or whether you've adopted all of these frameworks and ideas that come from the external. God knows there's enough of those that hit us every day. So if you're interested in the podcast, if you're interested in that sort of thing, some philosophy, some psychology, and some actual uses of them in day-to-day living, then go and buy my book on Amazon. You have to just search The Observing Eye, or I will put a link in the show notes for you to go and have a look at that as well. And I'm hoping that you will find it useful. So yeah, go buy my book. Subliminal messaging. Buy my book. You will buy it. Yeah, but just see what you think. Or don't. It's entirely up to you. There's no pressure. I have no expectation here. It is out into the world and I have let go of it. So it is just there. It exists. And you may enjoy it if you so choose. Thank you for your time. And we now return to the transmission. Now that we've defined psychological warfare and explored its ancient roots, let's turn our attention to its evolution over time. Psychological warfare has always been a part of human conflict, but it truly came into its own during the 20th century, particularly in the two world wars and the Cold War era. These periods saw the rise of mass media, the development of new technologies, and the realization by governments and military strategists that controlling the narrative could be just as important as controlling the battlefield. Let's start with World War I, often called the Great War. This was the first major conflict where psychological warfare was employed on a large scale, and it was a war that changed the way people thought about warfare forever. The horrors of trench warfare, with its unimaginable loss of life and grueling conditions, created fertile ground for psychological tactics. Both sides began to experiment with propaganda to maintain morale on the home front and to demoralize the enemy. One of the most effective tools used during World War I was the humble leaflet. The humble leaflet coming at you through your postbox. Millions of leaflets were dropped from planes over enemy lines filled with messages designed to sow doubt and fear among the troops. These leaflets often contained false information about the enemy's strength or the supposed hopelessness of the soldiers' situation, urging them to surrender or desert. The idea was simple. If you could convince just a few soldiers to give up, their despair might spread like a virus through the ranks, weakening the entire fighting force. But it was during World War II that psychological warfare reached new heights of sophistication and effectiveness. This was a war not just of armies, but of ideologies. Democracy versus fascism, freedom versus tyranny. The stakes were existential, and both the Allies and the Axis powers understood that winning the war would require more than just military might. It would require winning the hearts and minds of people around the world. One of the most infamous figures in the psychological warfare of World War II was Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda. Goebbels was a master of manipulating mass media to serve the Nazi cause. He understood the power of film, radio, and print to shape public opinion, and he used these tools to spread the Nazi message both within Germany and across occupied Europe. Through carefully crafted speeches, films, and posters, Goebbels sought to dehumanize the enemy, glorify the German cause, and maintain the morale of the German people, even as the war turned against them. On the Allied side, psychological warfare was also a critical component of the war effort. The British established a Political Warfare Executive, or PWE, which was responsible for coordinating propaganda efforts across Europe. One of their most famous operations was Operation Mincemeat, a daring and elaborate deception designed to mislead the Nazis about the location of the Allied invasion of southern Europe. The PWE planted false documents on a dead body, which was then allowed to be discovered by the Germans. The operation was a success, convincing the Nazis to divert their forces away from the true invasion site, and is often cited as one of the most successful deceptions in military history. And then there were the radio broadcasts. Both sides used radio as a powerful tool of psychological warfare. The Germans had Axis Sally and the Japanese had Tokyo Rose, broadcasters who spoke in English to American and British troops, spreading propaganda and attempting to demoralize them. These broadcasts mixed music with messages of doom, trying to convince soldiers that their cause was hopeless, that their loved ones had forgotten them, and that their leaders were lying to them. While many soldiers saw through these attempts, the broadcast still had an insidious way of getting under the skin, planting seeds of doubt that could fester over time. After the guns fell silent in 1945, the world found itself in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. This was a war fought not with tanks and bombs, but with ideology, espionage, and of course, psychological warfare. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a global struggle for influence, each side seeking to spread its ideology while undermining the others. Psychological warfare became a central tool in this struggle, and it was during this period that the term psyops came into common use. One of the most infamous examples of psychological warfare during the Cold War was the CIA's Project MKUltra. This was a covert program of experiments on human subjects aimed at developing techniques for mind control and interrogation. The project included the use of drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other methods to manipulate the human mind. While much of what happened in MKUltra remains shrouded in secrecy, the program reflects the intense fear and paranoia of the time, as both superpowers sought any possible advantage in their ideological struggle. You know, like that thing where they taught men to stare at goats until their hearts stopped through sheer willpower. Yeah, that one. It's a good movie with George Clooney. I recommend going and watching it if you've not seen it. Coen brothers, they always make good films. But psychological warfare during the Cold War wasn't just about secret experiments. It also involved mass propaganda campaigns aimed at influencing public opinion on a global scale. Both the US and the USSR invested heavily in broadcasting their messages to the world. The United States had the Voice of America, a radio service that broadcast news, music, and information about American culture and values to listeners behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union had Radio Moscow, which broadcast in multiple languages to promote communism and discredit Western capitalism. These broadcasts were about more than just news. They were about shaping perceptions, winning allies, and undermining the enemy's influence. The Cold War saw the rise of what we might now call information warfare, where the battle wasn't just for territory, but for the minds and hearts of people around the world. And then we arrive at the present day, where psychological warfare has evolved once again, adapting to the digital age. Today, the battleground is the internet, and the weapons are social media, fake news, and cyber attacks. The techniques of psychological warfare are now more sophisticated and more pervasive than ever before. Governments, organizations, and even individuals can now wage psychological warfare from anywhere in the world with just a few clicks of a mouse. And, some tapping of keys and shit like that you see in the 1980s hacker film. We've seen this in recent years with the rise of troll farms, where operatives create fake social media accounts to spread disinformation, sow discord, and influence elections. We've seen it with cyber attacks that not only disrupt infrastructure but also aim to create fear and uncertainty among the population. The lines between psychological warfare, information warfare, and cyber warfare have become increasingly blurred as the tools of manipulation have become more advanced and more accessible. So, as we can see, psychological warfare has come a long way from its early days of leaflets and loudspeakers. It has evolved into a complex tool of influence and control, one that is deeply intertwined with the techniques and media of the time. And while the tactics and techniques have changed, the goal remains the same: to influence, to manipulate, and to win the battle for the mind. As we move forward in this episode, we're going to dive deeper into the specific techniques and tools of psychological warfare, exploring how they work and why they're so effective. Now, let's break down some of the most important methods used in psychological warfare, from classic propaganda to modern digital manipulation. We're going to start with one of the oldest and most well-known tools of propaganda. Propaganda is at its core the art of persuasion. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping perceptions, and influencing public opinion in a way that benefits the propagandist's goals. The power of propaganda lies in its ability to present information in a way that resonates emotionally rather than logically. It appeals to the fears, hopes, and desires of its audience, often bypassing critical thinking altogether. Throughout history, propaganda has taken many forms. In times of war, it might be patriotic posters urging citizens to enlist, or newsreels glorifying military victories whilst downplaying defeats. In peacetime, it might be government campaigns promoting public health initiatives, or corporate advertising designed to create brand loyalty. But regardless of its form, the goal of propaganda is always the same: to shape how people see the world, and by extension, how they act within it. One of the most effective techniques within propaganda is the use of emotional appeal. This is where propagandists tap into powerful emotions like fear, anger, pride, or compassion to drive their message home. For example, during World War II, both the Allies and the Axis powers used fear as a central theme in their propaganda. Posters depicted the enemy as monstrous and inhuman, exaggerating their threats to stir up fear and hatred among the population. The famous Loose Lips Sink Ships campaign, I actually said that in the first take, is another example, using fear to discourage people from talking about military operations in public. But propaganda isn't just about stirring up negative emotions. It can also be used to create positive feelings like pride and unity. Consider the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter in the United States. This poster wasn't just about encouraging women to work in factories during World War II. It was about building a sense of collective strength and purpose. It told women that they were an essential part of the war effort, empowering them to take on roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. Beyond emotional appeal, another key technique in propaganda is the use of symbols and slogans. Symbols are powerful because they can convey complex ideas and emotions in a simple, memorable way. Think of the swastika in Nazi Germany, the hammer and sickle in the Soviet Union, or the bald eagle of the United States. These symbols go beyond mere imagery. They become icons that encapsulate entire ideologies. Slogans work in a similar way. Phrases like "Make America Great Again" or "Workers of the World Unite" are designed to be catchy, easy to remember, and capable of encapsulating a broader message or ideology in just a few words. But propaganda is just one tool in the arsenal of psychological warfare. Another crucial technique is misinformation and disinformation. As we mentioned earlier, misinformation is false or misleading, but without necessarily the intent to deceive, whereas disinformation is deliberately false and it's spread with the intention to mislead the recipient. Disinformation is particularly dangerous because it's designed to look like legitimate information, making it difficult to distinguish truth from falsehood. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in extensive disinformation campaigns. The KGB, for example, was known for planting fake news stories in Western media to create confusion and sow distrust. These stories were often designed to exploit existing social or political tensions, amplifying divisions and weakening the cohesion of the enemy's society. In today's world, disinformation has taken on new forms, especially with the rise of the internet and social media. We've all heard of fake news, but disinformation goes beyond just fake news stories. It involves deepfakes, manipulated videos, and even entire fake social media accounts designed to spread misleading narratives. These tactics are used not only by governments, but also by non-state actors, corporations, and even individuals seeking to manipulate public opinion for their own ends. Next, let's talk about psychological operations, or PSYOPs. PSYOPs are planned operations designed to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, ultimately leading to a change in behavior. PSYOPs can be overt, where the source is known, or covert, where the operation is designed to conceal the source. They can be used in military contexts, but also in political and social campaigns. One famous example of PSYOPs in action is during the Gulf War, where the US military used loudspeakers to broadcast demoralizing messages to Iraqi troops. These broadcasts included everything from warnings about imminent airstrikes to psychological tactics aimed at making the soldiers doubt their cause or their leadership. The goal was to weaken the enemy's resolve, making them more likely to surrender without a fight. Another aspect of PSYOPs is the use of psychological manipulation and influence techniques. These techniques tap into deep-seated cognitive biases and psychological triggers to influence behavior. For example, one common tactic is fear-mongering, where the enemy is portrayed as an existential threat, creating a sense of urgency and panic. This can lead people to make decisions based on fear rather than rational analysis, often to the advantage of those wielding the psychological weapons. Another technique is the appeal to authority. This is where propagandists use figures of authority, whether they be political leaders, military officials, or cultural icons, to lend credibility to their message. People are more likely to believe and follow the guidance of those they perceive as experts or leaders, even if the message is misleading or manipulative. In wartime, this might mean using generals or war heroes to endorse government policies. In peacetime, it could be celebrities promoting political agendas or social movements. As we move into the digital age, psychological warfare has adapted to new technologies and platforms. Social media manipulation is a prime example of how psychological warfare has evolved in the 21st century. Social media platforms like Facebook, X, and Instagram have become battlegrounds for influence campaigns. Whether it's through fake accounts, bot networks, or carefully targeted ads, the goal is the same: to manipulate the perceptions, emotions, and behaviors of large groups of people. One technique often used in social media manipulation, and I'm sure you'll have heard this, is the creation of echo chambers. These are online environments where users are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing beliefs, while opposing viewpoints are filtered out. This can create a distorted sense of reality where users become more polarized and less likely to engage with alternative perspectives. In psychological warfare, echo chambers can be weaponized to deepen divisions within a society, making it easier to manipulate public opinion and destabilize the social fabric. So, as we've seen, the techniques and tools of psychological warfare are varied and complex, ranging from traditional propaganda to modern digital manipulation. What ties them all together is the goal of influencing the mind, whether through fear, misinformation, manipulation, or emotional appeal. As we continue to explore the world of psychological warfare, it's important to remember that these tactics are not just relics of the past. They are alive and well today, and they have the power to shape our perceptions, our decisions, and the world at large. Next, we're going to delve into the psychology behind these tactics. Why are they so effective? What is it about the human mind that makes us susceptible to these forms of manipulation? And how can we protect ourselves from being unwitting targets of psychological warfare, aside from fashioning attractive tinfoil hats to just perch upon our bonces? Stay tuned. A bonce is an English slang word for head. If you're not from the UK, you'll be wondering what the fuck is a bonce. Tinfoil hats on your bonce. So, yeah, I detract. Stay tuned as we explore the continuingly unsettling world of psychological warfare in our next section. So we've explored the various techniques and tools of psychological warfare, but what is it that makes these tactics so effective? Why do they work so well in influencing people's thoughts, emotions, and behaviours? To answer these questions, we need to dive into the psychology behind psychological warfare, the underlying mental processes that make us vulnerable to manipulation. I'm going to start with the concept of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are mental shortcuts that our brains use to make sense of the world. They help us process information quickly, but they can also lead us astray. These biases are often exploited in psychological warfare to influence how we interpret information and make decisions. One of the most powerful cognitive biases is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. In other words, we're more likely to pay attention to information that supports what we already think, and we tend to ignore or dismiss information that contradicts our views. This bias is particularly effective in psychological warfare because it makes it easier to manipulate people by feeding them information that aligns with their existing beliefs. Propaganda, for example, often works by reinforcing what people already want to believe, making it more convincing and much harder to question. Another important cognitive bias is the availability heuristic. This is the mental shortcut we use to evaluate the likelihood of an event based on how easily we can recall examples of it. If something is easy to remember, we're more likely to think it's common or likely to happen again. Psychological warfare often leverages this bias by repeatedly exposing people to certain images, ideas, or narratives until they become ingrained in their minds. For instance, during times of conflict, the constant bombardment of war-related images and stories in the media can make people feel like the threat is omnipresent, even if the actual danger is relatively distant. Similarly, the anchoring bias can be used in psychological warfare to manipulate perceptions. This bias occurs when people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making decisions. If a propaganda campaign, for example, sets an initial narrative, such as labeling an opposing group as terrorists or savages, subsequent information is often interpreted through that initial lens, even if new information contradicts the original narrative. The anchor shapes how all future data is perceived, making it difficult to change people's minds once they've been influenced by that first piece of information. It's very much like the first impression thing, isn't it? People are very much guided by their first impressions of meeting someone, and that will dictate how they perceive and interact with that person going forwards until the other person may prove them wrong at some point down the road, which very often takes a lot of time. Cognitive biases are just one part of the equation. Psychological warfare also taps into our emotions, exploiting the powerful role they play in decision-making. Fear is perhaps the most commonly targeted emotion in psychological warfare, and for good reason. Fear is a primal response that can override rational thinking, screaming out from the depths of the amygdala, leading people to act in ways they might not otherwise consider. When people are afraid, they're more likely to accept extreme measures, believe in conspiracy theories, or rally behind authoritarian leaders who promise safety and security. Take note of that last statement there, people. Fear-mongering is a classic tactic in psychological warfare. During times of conflict, propaganda often emphasizes the threat posed by the enemy, exaggerating their power or brutality to create a sense of existential danger. This was seen, for example, in Cold War-era propaganda that depicted the threat of nuclear annihilation, pushing people to support aggressive military policies or to demonize those on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Fear can be a powerful motivator, leading people to make decisions based not on logic, but on the desperate need to feel safe. But fear isn't the only emotion that can be weaponized. Anger is another potent tool in psychological warfare. When people are angry, they're more likely to seek out information that confirms their feelings and to act out against those they perceive as the source of their anger. This makes anger a useful emotion for those who want to polarize societies or create divisions within a population. By stoking anger through inflammatory rhetoric, sensationalist media, or targeted disinformation, psychological warfare can turn groups against each other, weakening social cohesion and making it easier to control or destabilize a society. On the flip side, we've got to talk positive for a moment. Pride and patriotism can also be powerful tools in psychological warfare. By appealing to a sense of national or group identity, propagandists can rally people behind a cause, convincing them to make sacrifices or to support policies they might otherwise reject. This was seen in the use of patriotic propaganda during both world wars, where citizens were encouraged to contribute to the war effort, whether by enlisting, buying war bonds, or conserving resources. By tapping into a sense of pride, psychological warfare can create a collective identity that is difficult to break even in the face of adversity. Beyond individual emotions and biases, psychological warfare also exploits social identity and group dynamics. One of the most effective ways to influence behavior is to create an us versus them mentality, which can be used to unite people against a common enemy. This tactic plays on the human tendency to identify with groups, whether based on nationality, ethnicity, religion, or ideology, and to view those outside the group with suspicion or hostility. In-group, out-group dynamics are a powerful force in psychological warfare. When people see themselves as part of an in-group, they're more likely to conform to the group's norms, support its leaders, and defend it against perceived threats. This can lead to groupthink, where critical thinking is suppressed in favor of consensus, making the group more susceptible to manipulation. Propaganda often capitalizes on this by emphasizing the difference between the in-group and the out-group, portraying the latter as dangerous, inferior, or morally corrupt. This not only strengthens group cohesion, but also justifies aggressive actions towards the outgroup. The psychological tactics we've discussed so far, cognitive biases, emotional manipulation, and social dynamics, are incredibly effective because they tap into fundamental aspects of human nature. They exploit the way our minds are wired, using our natural tendencies against us. But understanding these tactics isn't just about recognizing how they work, it's also about learning how to protect ourselves from them. In a world where psychological warfare is more pervasive than ever, being aware of these tactics is the first step towards resilience. By understanding our own cognitive biases, we can become more critical of the information we receive and more discerning about the sources we trust. By recognizing when our emotions are being manipulated, we can take a step back and evaluate situations more rationally. And by being mindful of group dynamics, we can avoid the pitfalls of groupthink and maintain our ability to think independently. Kel Surprise, it's coming back to self-awareness again, isn't it? Psychological warfare is a battle for the mind, and like any battle, it's one that requires preparation and awareness to navigate successfully. As we move into the next segment of this episode, we're going to explore the ethical implications of these tactics, and we'll consider the moral dilemmas that arise when war is waged not just on bodies, but on minds. So far, we've explored the history, evolution, techniques, and psychology behind psychological warfare. We've seen how these tactics can be powerful tools for influencing minds and shaping outcomes in both war and peace. But as we delve deeper, we must confront an essential and challenging question. Is it ethical to use these tactics? What are the moral implications of waging war on the human mind? Psychological warfare, by its very nature, involves deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of human vulnerabilities. These tactics are designed to control and influence behavior without the target's full awareness or consent. Consent being an operative word there, I think. This raises significant ethical questions about the rightness or wrongness of such actions. To what extent can we justify the use of psychological warfare even if it serves a greater good? And where do we draw the line between legitimate strategies and unethical manipulation? Let's start by considering the utilitarian perspective. We're getting philosophical. You ready? We're going to get philosophical. It's about time. It's like, I don't know how far we're in because I'm going to edit the shit out of this. But yes, we're here. Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy that argues that the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. From this viewpoint, psychological warfare might be justified if it helps to achieve a desirable outcome, such as ending a war more quickly, saving lives, or preventing greater harm. For example, if a psychological operation convinces an enemy to surrender without a fight, thereby avoiding bloodshed, a utilitarian might argue that the benefits outweigh the ethical concerns about deception. However, the utilitarian perspective is not without its critics. One major issue is that it can be difficult, if not impossible, to accurately measure or predict the outcomes of psychological warfare. What if the tactics backfire, leading to greater harm rather than less? What if the manipulation causes long-term psychological damage to individuals or societies? And even if the outcome is positive, does that justify the means? These are questions that utilitarians and anyone involved in psychological warfare must grapple with. On the other hand, deontological ethics offers a different approach. Deontology is a moral philosophy that emphasizes the importance of following ethical principles or rules regardless of the consequences. From a deontological perspective, certain actions are inherently wrong no matter what benefits they might produce. Deontologists would argue that deception, manipulation, and the violation of an individual's autonomy are morally wrong in and of themselves, and thus cannot be justified even in the context of war. Consider the example of disinformation campaigns. From a deontological standpoint, deliberately spreading false information is inherently unethical because it involves lying and manipulating people's ability to make informed decisions. Even if the disinformation achieves a positive outcome, such as weakening an oppressive regime or preventing a conflict, the act of deceiving others is still considered morally wrong. This perspective raises important questions about the integrity and honesty of those who engage in psychological warfare. Is it ever acceptable to sacrifice truth for the sake of a strategic advantage? Just take a moment to think about that question. Another important ethical issue in psychological warfare is the impact on civilians. Unlike traditional warfare, which is often confined to the battlefield, psychological warfare can have far-reaching effects on entire populations. Civilians who are supposed to be protected under international law can become the targets of propaganda, disinformation, and fear-mongering. The blurring of the lines between combatants and non-combatants raises serious ethical concerns. Is it fair to manipulate innocent people to sow fear and confusion among them in the pursuit of military or political goals? The ethical dilemmas of psychological warfare become even more complex when we consider the long-term consequences of these tactics. Psychological operations can have lasting effects on individuals and societies, shaping beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours long after the conflict has ended. Propaganda used to demonize an enemy during a war, for example, can leave behind deep-seated prejudices and hostilities that persist for generations. Similarly, disinformation can erode trust in institutions and the media, leading to widespread cynicism and social fragmentation. These long-term effects raise important questions about responsibility and accountability. Who is responsible for the psychological harm caused by these tactics? And how should societies address the lingering effects of psychological warfare once the conflict is over? At this point, it's worth reflecting on the insights of philosophers who have grappled with the ethics of deception and manipulation. One such thinker is Immanuel Kant, whose deontological approach emphasized the importance of treating individuals as ends in themselves rather than a means to an end. Kant argued that we have a moral duty to respect the autonomy and dignity of others, which includes being honest and transparent in our interactions. From this perspective, psychological warfare, which often involves deceit and manipulation, would be inherently unethical because it treats people as tools to be used rather than as autonomous agents deserving of respect. On the other hand, I like to give you balanced opinions. Niccolo Machiavelli, the Renaissance political philosopher and author of that book, The Prince, which if you haven't read, go and do so because it is interesting. Machiavelli offers a more pragmatic and some might say cynical view. In his famous work, The Prince, Machiavelli argued that rulers must sometimes resort to deceit, manipulation, and even cruelty to maintain power and achieve their goals. Machiavelli would have done well in Game of Thrones, I think. For Machiavelli, the ends often justify the means, particularly in the harsh realities of political and military conflict. While this perspective is often criticized for its amorality, it reflects a realpolitik view that has influenced the practice of psychological warfare throughout history. The Prince is very often used as a textbook, a reference book for the acquisition of power. So all of you mad, power-hungry listeners out there, go and get that book. Ultimately, the effects of psychological warfare are deeply contested and may never be fully resolved. On one hand, these tactics can be seen as necessary tools in the brutal and often morally grey world of conflict. On the other hand, they raise profound questions about the morality of manipulating human minds and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. As we've seen, different ethical frameworks offer different answers to these questions, and the rightness or wrongness of psychological warfare may depend on one's perspective, like all things, I guess. Now, it's clear that the ethical considerations of psychological warfare are very, very complex. They challenge us to think critically about the tools and tactics we use in conflict, the values we uphold, and the kind of world we want to create. Whether we see psychological warfare as a necessary evil or an unacceptable breach of moral principles, one thing is certain. It forces us to confront some of the most difficult ethical questions in the realm of human conflict. As we've journeyed through the history and ethical implications of psychological warfare, it's become clear that this form of conflict is as old as warfare itself. But like all forms of warfare, it has evolved, adapting to new technologies and social landscapes. In today's world, the battleground of psychological warfare has expanded into a new frontier, the digital age. This shift has brought both unprecedented opportunities and profound challenges, transforming the nature of psychological warfare in ways we're only beginning to understand. The digital age has revolutionized how information is created, distributed, and consumed. With the rise of the internet, social media, and digital communication technologies, psychological warfare has found a powerful new platform. Where once propaganda had to be distributed through printed leaflets or broadcast over the radio, today it can be spread instantly to millions of people across the world. This speed and reach have made digital platforms a potent tool for those seeking to influence minds and manipulate perceptions on a global scale. One of the most significant developments in this new era of psychological warfare is the manipulation of social media. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitter X, isn't it now? It's X, I must remember. Or not, I suppose it doesn't really matter. Instagram and TikTok have become key battlegrounds where information and misinformation can be spread rapidly and widely. These platforms are uniquely suited to psychological warfare because they are designed to capture attention, encourage engagement, and create echo chambers where like-minded individuals reinforce each other's beliefs. One tactic often used in digital psychological warfare is the creation of fake accounts and bot networks. These are automated or semi-automated accounts designed to spread specific messages, often in a coordinated way. Bot networks can amplify certain narratives, making them appear more popular or credible than they actually are. They can also be used to harass or silence opposing voices, creating the illusion of consensus or overwhelming support for a particular viewpoint. In some cases, these bots are used to create or exacerbate social divisions, stirring up conflict and discord within societies. Another key tactic is the use of disinformation and fake news. As we've covered, disinformation has always been a tool of psychological warfare, but the digital age has made it more effective and harder to combat. Fake news articles, misleading memes, and doctored videos can be created and disseminated with ease, reaching vast audiences before they can be fact-checked or debunked. It's incredible what you can do with Midjourney now that it's on version 6, I think it is. I made an image of Donald Trump and a cow hybrid drinking some Chardonnay overlooking a field of ready-to-pick corn once. It was the resemblance was uncanny. This is particularly dangerous in the digital environment where speed and sensationalism often take precedence over accuracy and critical thinking. Once a piece of disinformation goes viral, it can be nearly impossible to fully retract or correct it, leaving a lasting impact on public perception. Going back to our idea around anchor bias, once we get the anchor, it takes a lot of effort for us to change our perceptions. We've seen the power of digital psychological warfare in several high-profile cases in recent years. Take, for example, the 2016 US presidential election. Russian operatives allegedly used social media to conduct a sophisticated influence campaign aimed at sowing discord and undermining trust in democratic institutions. Allegedly, they created fake social media accounts to pose as American citizens, spreading divisive content, and amplifying political polarization. This operation highlights how vulnerable even the most robust democracies can be to digital psychological warfare. Similarly, the rise of deep fakes, videos or audio recordings that are manipulated using artificial intelligence to make it appear that someone is saying or doing something they never did, has introduced a new level of complexity to the whole psychological warfare arena. Deep fakes can be used to discredit political figures, spread false information, or create panic. As this technology becomes more accessible, I think Midjourney is like $20, $30 a month or something, the potential for misuse in psychological operations is enormous, raising significant concerns about the future of trust and authenticity in digital communications. The digital age has also blurred the lines between cyber warfare and psychological warfare. Cyber attacks are not just about disrupting infrastructure or stealing information. They can also be used to create psychological effects. For instance, a cyber attack on a country's power grid can cause widespread panic and fear as people are left in the dark, literally and figuratively, about what is happening and why. Similarly, cyber attacks on media outlets or social media platforms can spread disinformation or manipulate public sentiment, blending digital sabotage with psychological manipulation. But it's not just state actors who are using these digital tools, unsurprisingly. Non-state actors, including terrorist organizations, hacktivist groups, and even individuals, can now engage in psychological warfare from the comfort of their own homes and on a massive scale. The low cost and ease of access to digital platforms means that almost anyone with an internet connection and an ounce of indecency can launch a psychological operation, whether it's to spread an ideology, incite violence, or simply sow chaos. Some people just like to watch the world burn, right? This democratization of psychological warfare poses significant challenges for governments and societies trying to defend against it. Another critical aspect of psychological warfare is the role of algorithms. Social media platforms and search engines use complex algorithms to determine what content users see based on their preferences, behaviours, and past interactions. While these algorithms are designed to keep users engaged, they can also be exploited for psychological manipulation. By feeding users content that reinforces their existing beliefs, whether they be true or false, these algorithms can create echo chambers and filter bubbles where users are shielded from alternative viewpoints and become more susceptible to manipulation. The algorithmic manipulation is particularly concerning because it can happen without users being aware of it. The content that appears in your social media feed or search results is not just a reflection of your interests, it's also shaped by algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy. This creates an environment where disinformation, sensationalism, and divisive content can thrive, making it easier for psychological operations to succeed. The rise of data-driven targeting is another game-changer in digital psychological warfare. With the vast amounts of data collected about individuals online, from their browsing habits to their social media interactions, psychological operations can now be tailored to target specific groups or even individuals with laser precision. This kind of micro-targeting allows for highly personalized propaganda designed to exploit specific fears, biases, or desires. It's a level of psychological manipulation that was unimaginable just a few decades ago. During elections, for example, political campaigns and even foreign actors can use data-driven targeting to deliver different messages to different segments of the population based on their demographics, behaviours, and beliefs. One group might see ads that play on economic anxieties, while another sees content that stokes cultural or racial tensions. This micro-targeting can be incredibly effective not only in influencing how people vote, but also in deepening social division and undermining trust in the democratic process. As we look to the future, optimistically one hopes, the challenges of psychological warfare in the digital age are only likely to grow. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and augmented reality could create new tools for psychological manipulation that we can scarcely imagine today. AI could be used to create even more convincing deepfakes or to automate the creation and dissemination of disinformation on a massive scale. Augmented reality could be used to create immersive experiences that blur the line between reality and fiction, making it even harder for people to discern truth from manipulation. But alongside these challenges, there are also opportunities for resilience. As awareness of digital psychological warfare grows, so too does the potential for developing new defenses. Media literacy education, for example, can help individuals become more critical consumers of information, better able to recognize and resist manipulation. Technological solutions, such as AI tools for detecting deepfakes or flagging disinformation, could also play a crucial role in defending against digital psychological operations. Ultimately, psychological warfare in the digital age is a double-edged sword. The same technologies that enable unprecedented levels of manipulation also offer massive new possibilities for understanding, communication, and connection. The challenge for societies moving forward will be to navigate this complex landscape, balancing the benefits of digital innovation with the need to protect against its potential for harm. As we reach the final segment of this episode, it's time to turn our attention to a crucial question. How can we protect ourselves and society from the effects of psychological warfare? In a world where the battle for the mind is increasingly fought online, what can we do to build resilience and safeguard our mental and emotional well-being? The first line of defense against psychological warfare is awareness. Simply understanding that psychological manipulation exists and recognizing the tactics that are used can go a long way in helping you resist its influence. We've discussed many of these tactics throughout this episode, from propaganda and disinformation to social media manipulation and echo chambers. By being aware of these strategies, you can start to see through the attempts to manipulate your thoughts and emotions rather than being swept along with them. One practical step you can take is to cultivate critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is the ability to analyze information objectively, evaluate evidence, and make reasoned judgments. In a context of psychological warfare, critical thinking involves questioning the sources of information you encounter, scrutinizing the motives behind the messages, and considering alternative perspectives before forming an opinion. This doesn't mean being cynical or distrusting of everything that you see, but rather approaching information with a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to dig deeper. Closely related to critical thinking is media literacy. Media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. It's about understanding how media messages are constructed, recognizing bias and manipulation, and being able to distinguish between credible and non-credible sources. In today's age, where information and disinformation flows freely across social media and other platforms, media literacy is more important than ever. To improve your media literacy, start by diversifying your information sources. Avoid relying on a single news outlet or social media feed for all your information. Instead, seek out a variety of sources, including those that offer different perspectives. This can help you get a more balanced view of the issues and reduce the risk of being trapped in an echo chamber. Additionally, take the time to verify the credibility of the sources you encounter. Check the author's credentials, look for evidence of peer review or fact-checking, and be wary of sensationalist headlines or articles that lack supporting evidence. Another key aspect of protecting yourself from psychological warfare is emotional awareness. As we've discussed, psychological manipulation often works by tapping into strong emotions like fear, anger, or pride. By becoming more aware of your emotional responses, you can start to recognize when you're being manipulated and take steps to manage your emotions more effectively. One way to build emotional awareness is through mindfulness practices. Oh God, he's talking about that hippie shit. Mindfulness involves paying attention to your thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations in the present moment without judgment. And the critical part is the without judgment bit at the end. By practicing mindfulness, you can develop a greater awareness of your emotional triggers and learn to respond to them in a more measured and thoughtful way, rather than reacting impulsively. This can help you to maintain a sense of calm and clarity, even when confronted with emotionally charged messages designed to provoke a strong reaction. Beyond individual strategies, it's also important to think about how we can protect society as a whole from the effects of psychological warfare. One way to do this is by creating social resilience. Social resilience refers to the ability of communities to withstand and recover from challenges, including those posed by psychological manipulation. A resilient society is one where people are informed, engaged, and connected, and where there is a strong sense of trust and social cohesion. Building social resilience starts with education. Educating the public about the tactics of psychological warfare and the importance of critical thinking and media literacy is essential. Schools, universities, and community organizations can play a key role in this effort, providing people with the tools they need to navigate the complex information landscape. I personally think it would be more useful to teach children some of this stuff about critical thinking and media literacy, rather than, spending 10 weeks looking at the wives of Henry VIII, because I've never used that again. It's interesting. I can still vaguely remember which ones died in which order, but it's not as useful as critical thinking. We need to start teaching critical thinking again, because it's such an important skill, particularly now, especially now. We also have to look to governments and tech companies to take responsibility, to promote transparency, to combat disinformation, and to protect the integrity of digital platforms. Another important element of social resilience is community and dialogue. Psychological warfare often seeks to divide and polarize societies, creating us versus them mentalities that weaken social bonds. To counter this, we need to create open, respectful dialogue across different groups and perspectives, which is not what I'm seeing at the minute. It'd been nice if we could just get a bit more towards that. How, I don't know. I'm just a guy doing a podcast at 2 a.m. This means actively seeking out conversations with people who hold different views, which is really important, by the way. I'd actively encourage you to go out and do that. Go and have a conversation with someone that you massively disagree with and just sit there in that space with them and actually listen to what they have to say and where that comes from. Listen to their experience. Find some common ground between the two of you. By building these bridges of understanding and empathy, that's another important thing, empathy, we can strengthen the social fabric and make it harder for psychological manipulation to take root. At the same time, we should be mindful of the role of technology in both enabling and countering psychological warfare. Social media platforms can be used to spread disinformation and amplify division, but they can also be powerful tools for education, connection, and community building. As users of these platforms, we have a role to play in shaping the online environment. This means being responsible and accountable digital citizens, fact-checking before sharing information, engaging in constructive rather than inflammatory discussions, and reporting harmful content when we see it. Finally, it's important to remember that protecting yourself and society from psychological warfare is not about shutting yourself off from the world or becoming paranoid about every piece of information you encounter. Instead, it's about engagement with intention. Engaging with the world around you in a thoughtful, informed, and deliberate way. It's about being aware of the forces that seek to influence you without allowing them to dictate your thoughts and actions. And it's about contributing to a society that values truth, empathy, and resilience, even in the face of challenges. As we conclude this episode on psychological warfare, I want to leave you with this thought. The battle for the mind is ongoing, and it's one that each of us has a role in. By arming ourselves with knowledge, fostering critical thinking, and building connections with others, we can resist the forces of manipulation and contribute to a world where truth and understanding prevail. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say on the subject of psychological warfare. Over the course of this episode, we've delved into the history of psychological warfare, tracing its evolution from ancient times to the digital age. We've uncovered the techniques and tools used to influence minds, from classic propaganda and disinformation to the sophisticated data-driven tactics of today. We've also examined the psychological principles that make these tactics so effective, and we've grappled with the ethical dilemmas that arise when war is waged not just on battlefields, but in the minds of people around the world. Psychological warfare, as we've seen, is a powerful force, one that has shaped the course of history and continues to influence our world today. It operates in the shadows, often unnoticed, but its effects are profound. It can undermine trust, sow discord, and manipulate entire populations. Yet it's also a reminder of the incredible power of the human mind, both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. We discussed how to protect ourselves and society from the effects of psychological warfare. Awareness, critical thinking, media literacy, and emotional resilience are all essential tools in this ongoing battle for the mind. But as we wrap up, it's important to remember that psychological warfare isn't just about defending against manipulation. It's also about creating a culture of truth, empathy, and understanding. The world we live in today is more connected than ever before, yet it's also more divided. The digital age has brought us closer together, but it has also created new opportunities for manipulation and division. In this landscape, it's up to each of us to be vigilant, to question the narratives we encounter, and to seek out the truth even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. It's up to us to engage with others, especially those who hold different views, with respect and empathy, building bridges instead of walls. As we move forward, let's carry with us the lessons we've learned in this episode. Let's be mindful of the power of words, images, and ideas, and the impact they can have on our thoughts, emotions, and actions. Let's commit to being informed, responsible citizens of the world, using the tools at our disposal not to manipulate or deceive, but to connect, educate, and uplift. And let's remember that, at its best, psychological warfare can teach us not just about the dark side of human nature, but also about the resilience and strength of the human spirit. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me on this deep dive into psychological warfare. It's a topic that fascinates me, and it's hugely relevant as much today as it's ever been. I hope that in some way you've got a bit of a perspective on some forces that shape our minds and our world, and it's given you some ideas and some stuff to think about. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast, leaving a review or some comments, or sharing it with others who might find it interesting, because all of that stuff just helps to support the podcast grow, and it shows me what content you're interested in, so I can start tailoring it to stuff that you want to hear, rather than me prattling about some 14th century philosopher that lived inside a badger den or something like that. Anyway, I digress. I also want to thank you for putting up with my nighttime voice. Talking like this for a long time has really dried my throat. It's like a parched desert. I can feel the cacti sprouting from my tonsils. But as always, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you, and I genuinely mean that. You can share your stories via Patreon, which is our new home, at patreon.com/theobservingeye, or on social media. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye, and on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @theobservingeye as well. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope it's been useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writing or work around psychology, philosophy, and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.com. And that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.